me poor old dad.
Whiskey Johnny,
And whiskey'd drive me mother mad.
whiskey for me Johnny,
Oh, whiskey here and whiskey there.
whiskey Johnny,
It's I'll have whiskey everywhere.
whiskey for me Johnny.
Welcome to Gloria Dei. We are in the church today filming the next of our great talks at Gloria Dei. So our speaker today is Michael Schreiber, who is on the board at Historic Gloria Dei and a local author. In his profile that we will be sharing on the website, we will include a link so that you can purchase Michael's book if you're so interested. It's a delightful read and full of information. So I'm going to hand off to Michael at this point, and we're being very socially distanced. Okay, we have our masks, so thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Candace. It's really a pleasure to talk with all of you today and to be here in the church. And I'd like to thank the Historic Gloria Dei Preservation Corporation for having me to speak to you. So, I wonder how many of you have thought of running away to sea. Maybe when you were children or even later in life. I too had such dreams. Treasure Island was one of my favorite books as a child. And I dreamt of leaving behind the humdrum world for one of unknown adventures on the high seas. So I was already 19 when I went to sea, and I remember my disappointment that my ship was not to be a glorious high-masted vessel, but an oil-propelled liberty ship called the Sunbeam. It was left over from World War II and about the same age as I was at the time. And I did have many adventures, and I finally signed off in Camden, New Jersey, just across the river from Center City, Philadelphia, from the waterfront. And I took a launch across the Delaware and tied up at one of the long finger wharves that still existed at that time. That area of the city was still part of the working port at the time. This is 1964. And that was in the final period before containerization changed the nature of longshore work, and the long piers became obsolete. It was before Penn's Landing and I-95 had been constructed, although the Society Hill Towers had recently opened, and Dock Street had recently been cleared of buildings and given over to parking lots. But the blocks along the river still contain row upon row of buildings constructed in the early decades of the 19th century, and some in the 18th century, with signs advertising maritime supplies for sale. In the area around this church, the city was fully connected to the waterfront until the end of the 1960s, when hundreds of houses and businesses were demolished for the construction of the I-95 expressway, it was then called the Delaware Expressway, and for other poorly thought out reasons. Many of those houses had been lived in for over 200 years and been the residences of many generations of people associated with the sea. Today, as you might know, it's a relatively rare occurrence to see an ocean-going vessel coming up the Delaware, but 200 or more years ago, there were generally well over 100 ships in port any given day. For perhaps 3/4 of a century, through most of the 18th century and on up to around 1815, Philadelphia was the largest port in North America. In the colonial period, it was probably busier than any British port, except London and Liverpool. Later, in 1793, total exports from Philadelphia equaled 1/4 of the tonnage for all the United States, exceeding all of New York and New England put together. And Philadelphia was a major shipbuilding center, due in part to the fine old-growth forests that surrounded the city. One English parliamentarian told the House of Commons in 1784 that the most beautiful ships, quote, are those built in Philadelphia, where this art has attained to the greatest perfection, equal, perhaps superior to any part of the world. So it might be curious that Philadelphia became a major port, since the problems in getting here from the open ocean were considerable. For one thing, depending on the winds, it could take 4 days to a week, or even more, to go up or down the Delaware River to reach the ocean. Moreover, it was the only port south of Canada that was blocked by ice in the winter, sometimes for many weeks or even months on end. And then the ships had to contend with being grounded on the shifting shoals in the bay and along the river. And finally, the bay itself was open to storms from the ocean that could just dash them onto the shore. There was no refuge at the mouth of the bay until the Delaware breakwater was constructed in the 1820s. But the ships and the shippers came here by preference because it had the largest concentration of people, including many with wealth and sophisticated tastes, and therefore they could get higher prices for finished goods than they could in New York. One could say that Philadelphia was first established in large part because of the river and its port. But then the port went on to prosper because of Philadelphia's leading position on the continent. The nature of the trade coming in and out of the port during the colonial period, and even during the early Republic, reflected what is typically seen in a colonial context, even today. While Pennsylvania had to import almost all of its finished goods from England, it exported raw materials. In the very early days of the city, the main exports were furs, skins, and lumber. And later, as the forests were cut down, the major export became wheat grain and milled flour. There were three main routes for Philadelphia vessels. The first one was down on the coast and to the West Indies, generally exporting flour to the islands in return for sugar, molasses, tropical fruits, coffee, and exotic woods. The second route was to Portugal and Spain, where the ships would pick up oranges, olive oil, cigars, and so on. And the third major route was to England. Now, the route to England had fewer ships than on the route to the West Indies, but they were the biggest and the best ships with the most experienced captains. The reason was that the goods that they carried from the mother country were by far the most valuable. But the problem was that Britain would not accept the major product that Philadelphia had to offer, wheat flour. They had tariffs against it. And so the shippers had to resort to a triangular trade. They would ship the flour to the West Indies or to Portugal in exchange for gold or silver or bills of exchange, which they could then spend in England to purchase finished goods and textiles to carry back to Pennsylvania. And of course, the more famous triangular trade was that of the slave trade. Flour and other goods to Africa, slaves to the West Indies, and sugar to the North American colonies. Slaves were never a major commodity in Pennsylvania, since the colony lacked the huge plantations that made slavery profitable in the South. People who are in lifetime bondage don't tend to work very efficiently or live very long. So the slave owners generally required single crop plantations worked by many slaves to furnish the lavish lifestyles the slave owners were accustomed. But when slave auctions were held in Philadelphia, such as the ones in front of the London Coffee House at Front and Market Streets, buyers came from many miles around, including some from the large tobacco plantations in Maryland and southern Delaware. Slave merchants like Willing Morris and Company even transported likely buyers from Wilmington, Delaware, free of charge. In the 1760s, the slave trade briefly flourished in the Philadelphia area. This was because the war between Britain and France had produced a shortage of labor when white indentured servants were mustered into the king's army, and immigration from Europe tailed off. In the first issue of the Founders magazine, which is associated with the historic Gloria Dei Preservation Corporation, there's an article about Joseph Bloor, whose grave, along with that of his wife, lies close to the front doors of this church. Bloor was an important patriot in the American Revolution, but he was a slave trader in the 1760s. In July 1765, Bloor carried 70 people from Africa to be sold in Philadelphia on behalf of the Willing Morris Company, and appears to have transported many others to Barbados for hard labor on the sugar plantations. Even during the Revolution, when Bloor served as a member of the Pennsylvania legislature, he voted against a measure for gradual emancipation of the slaves, arguing that the law went too far in offering freed slaves the full rights of citizens. In the late 18th century, mariners were the largest occupational class in Philadelphia, perhaps 20% of the working men in the city. It's estimated that over 1,200 seafarers made Philadelphia their home in the early 1770s, although the exact number is hard to come by since many mariners were too poor to be included on the tax rolls, and many were transients going from port to port, wherever they could find work. Research shows that the greater portion of mariners in Philadelphia were not born in the city, but came from urban areas throughout the North American colonies or in Britain or other European countries. They generally came from families on the lower end of the economic spectrum and were not in a good position to take up a trade or turn to farming, for example. So they usually went to sea, and they braved its dangers out of economic necessity. One study that I looked at analyzed the men who were portrayed on seamen's protective certificates around the year 1800. These certificates were carried by seamen who were U.S. citizens to try to protect them from being kidnapped and impressed into the Royal Navy, on the pretense that they could not prove that they were not British citizens or subjects. The certificates are a major tool for historical researchers today because they describe items such as where and when the mariners were born, the name of their current ship, plus physical characteristics such as scars or tattoos. The particular study of certificates found that the subjects remained mariners for only around 7 years on average. Many remained at sea until they could obtain a job on land, where they were not exposed to such extreme dangers and were able to find or to spend more time with their families. And yet the pay for an ordinary seaman was fairly low among the lower paying occupations, and thus the trade tended to attract many men who were relatively unstable and who, for one reason or another, such as alcoholism, found it difficult to obtain higher paying jobs. A British sea captain, writing in 1790, wrote of the difficulty of recruiting crew members in America. They were, he complained, quote, generally half drunk. They do not care what trouble they give, and may be justly compared for obstinacy to the wild ass of the wilderness. The captain went on to say, the houses they board at and the brothels they frequent here have scarcely any furniture, and are the most filthy places of this description I have ever met in this country. The sailors' chests are placed around the room, and serve both for seats and beds. And in the summer are the residence of innumerable hosts of flies, which creep into their punch glasses, being attracted by the sugar. It was very rare for an ordinary seaman to rise up to be a mate or captain. The educational background of most seamen, and many could not read or write, didn't enable them to master the navigational and the business skills that captains needed to possess. And those who did become captains often came from families in which their fathers or uncles were captains, so they could learn the trade through apprenticeship. Many captains preferred to sail with black, or mainly black, crews. They understood that free black seamen were often more stable, sober, and harder working than whites were. While seafaring was one of the lowest paying jobs for white men, it was more of an upper income job for blacks, since free black people had much fewer economic and social opportunities on land than whites did. And so, black men tended to stay on the job longer than whites and worked harder in order to strive to keep their jobs. Many blacks were given leading positions on ships as able-bodied seamen, but they could rise only so far. The chances that a black seaman would rise to the position of a mate or a captain was almost non-existent. Beginning in the late 18th century and until the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, large numbers of black men went to sea, about 20% of the workforce. The great majority of the black seafarers were free, but not infrequently, slave masters would rent out their slaves to serve on the ships. And sometimes the white captains or even ordinary seamen would bring men whom they owned as slaves on board, which would give them the ability to pocket their wages. When my fellow researcher here at the Preservation Corporation, Amy Grant, and I were researching one of the mariners who are buried here in the churchyard, a white man named Jacob Jackson, we often came across references to a black mariner who had the same name and who, rather confusingly, was born the same year. So just a couple of years ago, I decided to look further at the career of the black Jacob Jackson, searching through crew lists at the Port of Philadelphia and newspapers of the period. And I found, in fact, that there were at least 2 black mariners who had that name. The one that I just referred to, at age 19, served on the brig Lydia to Antigua in 1798, as his seaman certificate attested to. And he might be the same Jacob Jackson who appears on Philadelphia crew lists in 1811 and 1814. In 1814, on the schooner Union going to Havana, Jacob Jackson was one of 5 black men who made up the crew, while the captain and the mate were white men. In other words, the whole crew was black. Another black Jacob Jackson from Philadelphia appears on crew lists in 1826, when he was 26 years old, until the year 1829, when he deserted in Rotterdam, Holland. In fact, the entire crew deserted the ship except one man named Mince McCall, who the record says was paid off in Rotterdam. I really looked, but I was unable to find exactly what happened on that voyage to cause the crew to desert, except for one curious item. I noticed that the vessel, it was the brig Commodore Barry, had left Philadelphia on April 20th, bound for Rotterdam. But instead of heading across the Atlantic, it headed for Virginia first. And it reached Rotterdam a month or so later and appeared ready to sail again on June the 22nd, but late in July, it was still in port. And then the crew deserted. And the vessel didn't sail again until July 28th. And again, it made stops. Spain and Virginia again. And it didn't arrive in Philadelphia until October 19th, 6 months after leaving. The newspaper called it a long passage, but it was extraordinarily long time for an Atlantic crossing. So, in thinking about this, it might have been that the crew had not signed up for such a long and roundabout route and wanted to go home. And for a black man, of course, there would have been additional anxiety in sailing to Virginia, since it was not unknown for unscrupulous sea captains to sell free black crew members into slavery when they visited southern ports. Also, beginning in South Carolina in 1822, just a couple of years before this, black seamen were subject to what was called the Negro Seamen's Acts, which provided for the incarceration of black mariners in city jails until such time as the ship left port. The law was passed principally because the slave owners feared that their slaves would be stirred up to rebellion by seeing all these free black seamen walking around the streets. So as a consequence, an estimated 10,000 black seamen were imprisoned under the Negro Seamen's Acts until the laws were abolished in the Civil War. Now, very occasionally, women too went to sea as part of the crew. One of them, Emma Barnes of Moscow, Maine, age 17, was arrested here in Philadelphia for wearing male apparel in December 1855. According to her story, she had been married 2 years earlier and had a child, but her husband deserted her and went to sea. And so for the past 18 months, she had shipped out in various vessels in order to search for her husband. And most recently, she had served on the James Ree, using the name George Stewart. A Philadelphia newspaper called the Ledger transcribed her comments at her trial before a city alderman. So the alderman said, "Are you a sailor, and can you go aloft and do all you ought to do?" She replied, "As an ordinary seaman, I think I have no superior. As a cook and a steward, every captain has said I was a number one. Do you like the sea? That I do. Rough as it is, there is something pleasant about it. A landsman's life is but one thing over and over again. A sailor at sea is kept too busy to be troubled with blues." "Didn't you lick a Yankee captain once?" "That I did. It was round the Horn. I mind it well. He was a big fellow, as big as I am, but over 6 feet. He picked a quarrel with me and struck me with his fist. I knocked him down with a left-handed blow. He fell on the quarter-deck and howled like a calf, and I gave the saucy fellow just what he deserved." "Were you not afraid to trust yourself with sailors?" "God knows I was not. They're easily managed, and generally speaking, They are the warmest-hearted beings in the world. I drank and I smoked with them at all times. George Stewart hasn't an enemy among them." The ledger commented that, quote, "the discovery of her sex by the mate of the James Ree occurred from her having unintentionally responded to an order given while aloft, furling sails, in a feminine tone instead of the rough voice previously used. He at once charged her with being a female, and she acknowledged it." Although, as Emma Barnes, alias George Stewart, pointed out, the camaraderie amongst seamen could be strong, there were also many tensions within crews. You might expect as much when men from disparate backgrounds were working for many months in close quarters, and when there's often little to do in the free time on board but drink alcohol. As a deck boy, I had the very lowest status on board, but I remember one kindly old salt with twinkling blue eyes who everyone called Finland because that was his home country. And I remember him sitting down with me in one or two of his sober moments and showing me the rudiments of tying knots. But I also remember another fellow who was a younger Norwegian coming at me with a knife and being ready to slit my throat for some imagined slight that I might have made against him. Luckily, other seamen held him back and convinced him I was only a kid and I didn't know what I was saying. So the discipline of the officers toward the men is also very tight aboard ships, as it always has been. And as one manual pointed out in 1846, the Shipmaster's Assistant and Commercial Digest, which I found in the library at the Philadelphia Athenaeum, quote, "The contract of a sailor is somewhat military in character. The master is entitled to prompt obedience. To ensure this, strict discipline must be observed, and if his crew fail in their duty, he may resort to force. Any resistance to him, except for the preservation of limb or life, may expose the sailor to the charge of revolt and mutiny. These offenses are punished by a fine not exceeding $2,000 and imprisonment with hard labor not exceeding 10 years. Further, it said in regard to punishments, chastisement must not be a blow with a fist or a stick. The seamen ought to be flogged with a rope before the crew, who should be at the same time apprised of the offense. Because of the abusive manner in which the crews were often treated by officers, seamen sometimes escaped their harsh conditions by turning to piracy, in which they found on-board relations that were generally conducted much more democratically. Many times pirate captains were elected by the crew and similarly subject to vote for recall by the men. The quartermaster often assumed the role of judge in arbitrating disputes among the crew or between the crew and the captain, and he saw to the distribution of the loot. Each pirate crew member was given a set share of the booty, and I'm going to say more about pirates in a later video from this series of talks. Of course, bad enough as flogging and other punishments might have been, an ocean voyage held much greater perils. The words "lost at sea" are the most melancholy and often mysterious inscriptions that they have on the gravestones here at Gloria Dei. In those cases, the stones, of course, are merely markers for a person who never came home and never saw their loved ones again. Their lives were cut off, as the victims of a disaster somewhere across the ocean. 200 years later, it's generally difficult to research exactly what happened to such people because there's no official death or burial records to refer to. The researcher has to try to develop the story out of materials such as shipping reports and newspapers of the period, crew lists submitted to the Philadelphia port authorities, perhaps occasional letters or documents that could be stored away in an archive. And in a subsequent video, we will present a number of stories of some of the people associated with Gloria Dei who were lost at sea. In the remaining time, let me just give you one illustration. We'll take a look at the case of Charles D. Schellinger, who was drowned off the Delaware Capes in 1889. Charles worked from the pilot schooner Enoch Turley, which sank with all hands during a hard gale in April of that year. And he's commemorated on a stone here in the Gloria Dei churchyard, along with his widow, Elizabeth Schellinger, who died in 1907, and she is buried here. For close to 3 centuries, experienced pilots have guided sea-going vessels through the rather treacherous waters of Delaware Bay and the river. Piloting could be highly dangerous in these waters, where the currents were unpredictable, storms could sweep in with little warning. And as I mentioned, there's numerous shoals, constricted channels, and the unbroken shore gave no refuge. And for that reason, pilot boats were often called upon to rescue mariners who had been caught in storms or the winter ice. So Charles was born around 1831 in Philadelphia, and he probably lived as a child here in the Southwark district, today generally what's known as Queen Village. He apprenticed as a pilot while still in his teens. For most of the 1850s, he resided in the state of Delaware, where he married Elizabeth Rowland, daughter of another pilot. The Rowlands lived in the seaside community of Rehoboth, if I pronounce it correctly, Delaware, where Elizabeth was a small girl in the 1830s. Later, they moved a few miles north to Lewis, which lies just above Cape Henlopen on the Delaware Bay. Their house is now open to the public from May through October as a maritime museum and the headquarters of the Lewis Historical Society. And the museum has a coffee urn in its collection that was made for Charles D. Schellinger by friends. And it also has a model of the pilot boat, Enoch Turley, in which Schellinger lost his life. In the 1870s, the family lived at various addresses close to the Philadelphia southern waterfront. Around 1880, they moved to a recently built brick house at 140 Mary Street, today League Street, which is still standing. That's very close to where I am right now, to the church. The pilot boat, Enoch Turley, was a small schooner, 70 feet in length, with 12 berths in her cabin and 2 masts. She was named in honor of a Philadelphian who was esteemed as a sea captain in the early 19th century and who died suddenly at age 39 in 1823. But the Turley was born in Baltimore and launched on the Delaware in 1842. The Philadelphia Public Ledger, November the 25th, 1842, reported, quote, "The new pilot boat, Enoch Turley, Captain William Baker, was tried yesterday afternoon for the first time. She's a beautiful craft, was in full dress with every rag she could carry, and skimmed the water like a bird. A large party were on board of her, who were elegantly entertained by the captain. In late November of that year, however, the Turley was blown ashore in a heavy wind off the Indian River inlet. It was feared that she was a total wreck, but with some difficulty she was raised and her keel was rebuilt. So, back in service in September 1844, the Enoch Turley engaged in a race with the pilot boat Herald, and the Public Ledger reported on September 12th that, quote, "The boats left Southwark this morning crowded with ladies for a race and excursion, the stake being a sumptuous repast for all hands, to be paid for by the losing boat." Throughout the next decades, the Enoch Turley continued to carry pleasure seekers on excursions as far as Newport, Rhode Island. An account in the Philadelphia Press, August 28, 1866, described a voyage on the pilot boat. Quote, "On the morning of the 16th instant, the pilot boat Enoch Turley rode at anchor a short distance from the beach at Cape May. Graceful as a waterfowl, she rose upon each wave like a thing of life, and those who saw her from the shore predicted a safe and pleasant trip to the pleasure party about to embark on her for the waters of the Chesapeake. Wind changing in our favor carried us flying before it, down the bay and out to sea, and the Enoch Turley proved her speed and excellent seagoing qualities by returning us to the starting point in 16 hours from the time we left Fortress Monroe. Noble little craft, and nobler men who commanded her, are not her and her virtues forever inscribed in our memories?" However, the hard-working schooner also performed a number of crucial rescues of disabled vessels. Several weeks after the Turley disappeared at sea, the Delaware Gazette and State Journal, this is May 2nd, 1889, reminisced. "She has always been considered an able and safe boat and a favorite among Delaware pilots all through her long and useful career." And one of the boat's owners, Captain Harry Long, who was a pilot himself, told the Inquirer on April 13th that, "Although very old, the Turley was well found and capable of standing any type of weather. She weathered the great gale of November 1888 in gallant style." So the year 1888, it's famous. That was really grueling for the Delaware Bay pilots. The United States Life Saving Service's annual report for 1889 recounted their heroic actions during the extreme cold and blizzard conditions in March and April of the previous year. And the Enoch Turley played a role in these rescues, but she encountered her own perils. Before dawn on March 5th, one of her pilots, John West, fell into the icy water as he was climbing onto the deck of the steamship Indiana, and he remained in the water for half an hour till he was found floating half a mile away. He was still alive, but he was unconscious. And then, a little more than a week later, on the morning of March 12th, a tremendous storm and blizzard roared into Delaware Bay, and 24 vessels were wrecked, and crew members and passengers were swept into the sea. And the Enoch Turley became snagged on a shoal near the Lewis breakwater, where she lost her masts. But again, the boat and her men emerged relatively unscathed due to a timely rescue operation. And so the Life Saving Services report stated that the Turley, quote, had dragged ashore at 8 o'clock in the morning and was lying about 75 yards off the beach. with the heavy seas washing over her. The lifesavers succeeded in firing a line to her, and after some difficulty, occasioned by the vessel's crew being so benumbed with cold that they could not readily handle the gear, the whip and hawser were got in working order, and all hands, numbering 7, were safely landed, one at a time, in the breeches buoy. The rescue was a timely one, as the men were nearly used up from the severe exposure to which they had been subjected for several hours. So, on November 26, 1888, while cruising off the Capes, the Turley encountered the great gale that Long had spoken of in a quote we read a moment ago, coupled with a heavy snowstorm. In that one, she was blown far south, but she was able to find harbor at Fortress Monroe, Virginia, at the mouth of the Chesapeake, and didn't suffer very serious damage. So this is a whole series of mishaps in just a couple of years, and this caused some pilots to come to the opinion that the Enoch Turley was hexed. On May 22, 1889, the Philadelphia commented, "The old boat was looked on as particularly unlucky for the past 3 years, as she has been ashore several times and otherwise in trouble, and on that account the pilots were a little afraid of her." So, just over 4 months after this great gale of 1888, a far more powerful gale struck the coast. And this was the one that led to the demise of the Enoch Turley and the death of Charles D. Schellinger and 9 other men who were aboard her. The storm began on Saturday, April 6th, and it continued into Sunday. And the damage really was considerable. The Philadelphia Inquirer reported that in the aftermath of the storm, Rehoboth, the former home of Elizabeth Schellinger, looked like the ruins of some ancient city. The boardwalk had washed away, and the pavilion that used to stand at the foot of Rehoboth Avenue had blown down. And as usual in such circumstances, the Enoch Turley went to sea in search of vessels that might need assistance in the storm. But it appears that the pilot boat was blown towards the south, just as had happened the previous November. And the Inquirer later reported, quote, "The last seen of the missing vessel was on the night of Saturday, April the 6th, when the bark Waiho passed her and reported her as scudding for Hampton Roads. A search was made for the boat, but nothing definitive was found of her. Contradictory reports of wrecks that might have been the Turley continued to appear for a couple of weeks more, and finally, on April 26th, the Turley's co-owner, that's Captain Harry Long, was quoted in the Inquirer as stating, "It is cruel to raise false hopes. My opinion is that the Turley has gone down with all hands." And a fund was taken up for the widows and children. Agent Young of the Pennsylvania Pilots Association pointed out that families were severely hurt by the loss of their breadwinners, and he added that in fact there were 2 or 3 of the lost pilots whose earnings were the entire support of the family. And so the legend persists even today that on stormy nights over the Atlantic, the ghostly shape of the Enoch Turley can be seen, trying to make its way back to the breakwater and safety. So, that's it. In the next video presentation, I'll recount additional stories of people who are associated with this church in the 18th and 19th century who were lost at sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I hope everyone enjoyed Michael's lecture, and we will be having a part 2 of that, Perils of the Sea, probably coming up later in 2021. And meanwhile, our work on the Keystone Grant continues. Our project, they are painting the exterior of the church today, so repair and painting. They've made wonderful progress over here at Riverside Hall. So we hope that you will consider hitting the donate button and make a gift towards preservation at Historic Gloria Dei. Thank you so much.
So one of the interesting things for me about this particular talk is that I have known you for a very long time, and I had no idea that you had spent time at sea. So I have a lot of questions. So you talked a little bit about your experience on the Sunbeam. Where did you sail? How long were you at sea? What was the experience like?
Well, it wasn't very long, really. Let me put this cat down. I'm sorry. I had been, at the time, I was working in New York City as at an auction house, and it wasn't all that interesting. And a friend of mine said, say, you can ship out and have a bit of adventure by going down to the Scandinavian Seamen's Hall in Brooklyn. So that's what I did. And the next day I was on the motor ship Sunbeam, a Norwegian ship, bound for South America. So I think it was, I had wonderful adventures that still are somewhat significant in my life as touchstone types of memories, but including some of the things I spoke about in this talk. Well, I guess one of the first things was I learned the hierarchy there on board. You had, the captain, the mates, the bosun, who was like our immediate supervisor, able-bodied seamen who were highly experienced and whose lead we followed, and then the ordinary seamen, and then you had me down at the bottom, some kid. I started off as a cabin boy there, and then I became what they called a deckskut, a deck boy. So it was very, very military-like, and we were sort of segregated. We seamen we lived in a dorm. We bunked in a dorm with bunk beds, and I remember at least a couple of times in heavy storms, and you open the door and the waves would come sloshing in, so you get out of your bunk in the morning and there's water in the floor, and then the officers, of course, lived a level above us. Once, in fact, I right on the stairs, they had this grand map. I think it was a map of the world or something. And I inched my way up to try to look at the map. And then one of the officers, one of the mates, spots me, and he wouldn't even speak to me. He just went down. So anyway, I was, in the beginning, I was seasick, couldn't eat, all the way to the Panama Canal. And then we went down the west coast of South America. And I know in this talk, I was just reminded that I spoke about the colonial trade that Pennsylvania used to have. So we were essentially in a neo-colonial trade because we brought down Ford automobiles and machinery and so on, and we came back with fish meal and guano, bird droppings.
Right. Yeah.
And I remember you have these white cliffs there in Peru of bird droppings, accumulated over tens of thousands of years. And so you can see I can go on and on and on and on that one question. I'll just end here, because why did I sign off? Well, one thing was, remember in Ecuador, we went up a river for miles and miles and miles, and it was gray, the water and the sky and were just they were silhouetted in these black branches, and there you'd see the native people there in their kayaks in bright red costumes. And there at our destination at this port was the ship Hope. It was a hospital ship that what they call it, the Project Hope had at the time, going around with doctors and so on. And we went on board, and there we saw how American seamen were, with a library and books and television and so on. So I think we all realized how dreadful our conditions were. And since I was a kid, there was nobody my age and so on, I wasn't that happy. So I signed off in Camden, New Jersey, as I said. I intended to do it again. I tried. It didn't work out. So that was my one voyage.
Okay, and how long was that?
It was only about 2.5, maybe 3 months.
Okay. You mentioned visiting Philadelphia after the Sunbeam docked in Camden. Can you tell us more about what the city was like during that time?
Well, yeah, that's a question with a very wide scope. I can only give a few impressions. I think I think, obviously then it resembled more the old city that we've been talking about, and you and I, Amy, have been researching, from the 19th century and the early 20th century. You still had the movie theaters in every neighborhood, and the downtown uh, uh, department stores and so forth. I think the city was a bit shabby, maybe shabbier, at least in the central area, but it was very livable, more pedestrian, I think. Like South Street was still in 1964, still a neighborhood street of small shops, clothing stores, pawn shops. I remember talking to one pawn shop operator who told me how Bessie Smith, the old blues singer, used to come into his shop and so on. But in 1964, it was a city that was conscious of rebuilding and modernizing. And they were just tearing down everything. Large sections were like just parking lots. As I mentioned, the Society Hill Towers, they were completed in 1964, but they were like islands, and all of Dock Street that had just been torn down was just a big parking lot. And the Callow Hill area, for example, where I used to spend a lot of time, there at that time you could still see the old city, and signs on buildings advertising rope and tackle and maritime supplies and so on. And there were a lot of cheap hotels for seamen and other transient workers. And it was beautiful, I felt. I spent a lot of time exploring that area. And I'll mention, I don't want to go on too long, but I did make a film. It was a few years later in 1967. And it had to do with the adventures of an older woman in this city that was sort of crumbling around her. So we filmed the interiors, sound film, in West Philadelphia, and then we had the woman coming out of a house in Elfress Alley.
Uh-huh.
And she walked just as the train went by on the elevated, because the elevated used to go there right over Front Street. And so she goes under the elevated train, and then she goes down the Cherry Street steps, which were still there then, and down Water Street. And then we cut to the head house on 2nd Street. And that area was desolate then. All the buildings around there, a lot of them had just been torn down, but the ones that you see now that are restaurants and so on were abandoned. And so I staged an anti-war demonstration. I got my friends, my sister Lynn, and so on, and everybody with signs, and we made a ring around the head house as some municipal building in this landscape of desolation and so on. But unfortunately, all my films were destroyed in a fire in San Francisco. So it'd be worth an awful lot to see it today, but you can't.
Yeah, so I threw it in the part of the presentation where you were talking about what the city was like before I-95, I threw in a photograph that my next door neighbor had taken, I think from his roof. And you could see that I-95 was just constructed. There are no cars on the road, and there are a couple of people, and there's a dog walking. So it's a really great photo. That's why I threw that in. I thought that people might appreciate seeing what that looked like right after it was built. And also you could see around in that photo how much was demolished to create that road. So it's interesting. Yeah, so you describe how Philadelphia was a major port during the 18th and 19th centuries. Can you tell us what types of ships one would see sailing down the river?
Well, when you look at those old prints and paintings of the time, it's amazing, or I'm always amazed by the great variety of vessels that you see. Everything from, fishing boats to ferries to packets that carried the mail, up and down or to sea, or passenger boats. And then you had ones that took long voyages across the world. So you can categorize the various vessels by their function or also by their configuration. And you and I, Amy, in our researches have to know sometimes, or at least acknowledge the difference between, let's say, a brig and a schooner or something like that, because you would get, let's say it's a vessel's called the Mary. But is it the brig Mary or the schooner Mary or the ship Mary and so on? It makes a lot of difference if you want to trace it, on all its travels. And also at that time, it was necessary because you'd see, a vessel of some type across the sea coming to you, and you wanted to try to identify who it was. For the merchants and the families back home, who did you see crossing your path? So, but as far as those configurations, they weren't always that accurate. And what's the difference between a sloop and, and so on? Sometimes they made mistakes then also. And they were classified according to the types of sails, the configuration of the sails, the position of the masts, the shape of the boat or the vessel itself, and so on. Essentially, and I don't think anybody's going to be tested on this, and I don't remember it all that well, but a sloop is generally a vessel with a single mast. A schooner has two masts, relatively small, with a certain kind of rigging. And a ketch, let's say, that has two also, but it's really sort of, it it was a larger three-masted at one point, and they got rid of the four masts, so they're towards the rear.
Okay.
That's a catch. And a bark, well, a bark has a square stern, like a larger ship might have. And a brig has two masts, but it has two sails. Two sails. It has, sorry, it has square sails, right? And a snow has, it's like a brig, but it has a little extra mast at the rear with the rear spanker sail going in, going out. So you don't have the spanker sail from that mast. It doesn't. You have more flexibility with the extra mast. And what else? Well, in military terms, I should say, you often come across frigates and ships. Most often, the sea novels deal with people captains who are sailing frigates, because a frigate is sort of a medium-sized vessel, but it's smaller than a ship. And thus it can go off on its own. It's more adroit and so forth, and subject to more adventures and so on. So basically, a frigate would have, it has three masts, but it's low in the water, and it only has the guns like on the deck, or maybe on one gun deck below that. Whereas a ship, a capital ship, is like a fortress. It could have 40 some to 70 or more guns in three different decks. And that was, in 18th century terms, it was used for a different kind of battle, because you'd have a whole line of these ships here, and they could just blow anything out of the water. Whereas a frigate, like something like a destroyer today, it could go around and and do its thing. If that's clear.
Yeah, that's great. You also mentioned that Philadelphia was a major shipbuilding center in the 18th and 19th centuries. Can you give us some examples of the shipyards that were there, and what types of ships were they building? Is it similar to what you just described, or were they building other things?
Well, yeah, Philadelphia, developed over the 18th century as a inequality, especially of shipbuilding. From the beginning of the century, the American ship, the American colonies became shipbuilding centers, especially because lumber was plentiful here and thus cheap. So you hear about New England, but Philadelphia and Pennsylvania was just as large, and Virginia was a major shipbuilding area also. But often they didn't have the craftsmanship that they would have in, let's say, a British or a French ship. But that changed as the century wore on and the population of craftsmen increased, of carpenters and joiners and so forth. So by the end of the century, one name that is of some renown is that of Joshua Humphrey, who had his shipyard right near the church, just a little bit to the south. At one point it was there. And Humphrey was quite a genius, you might say, of shipbuilding. He was able to make frigates, but even lower and sleeker, by lowering the decks, but strengthening the frame of these vessels. And the product were the three large frigates of the new U.S. Navy right at the end of the century, which was the SS United States, which was built right here, I mean, right in our neighborhood, the Constitution up in Boston, and the Constellation that was built in Baltimore, that were all built according to Humphrey's plans. And then, well, you show a picture of the Philadelphia in
Yeah.
Amy, incidentally, for this video. We both saw Amy quite beautifully. Was the one who put in all the illustrations and stuff. I love them. But you showed William Birch's print
Yeah.
of
Yes.
the construction of the Philadelphia, and you can see Old Swedes Church right in the background there.
Yeah.
And the Philadelphia was another frigate that was built just a few years after the United States. But as people might know, it came to a very sad end. It was captured by the so-called Tripoli pirates, the Bay of Tripoli, and the U.S. sent a team of commandos under Stephen Decatur into the harbor there, and they set it on fire. So it didn't have much of a life, but it had a spectacular end.
Yeah.
The question was about shipbuilding.
It was a
So
good
I did want to say that the Humphrey shipyard over here later became the U.S. Naval Yard, just right south of Washington Avenue, and was that for many years until I think the 1870s, when it moved to League Island. And in general, there were other shipyards in this neighborhood of what's now Queen Village, and also up in Kensington. The first shipyard that I think we know of was the West Shipyard, which was just a little north of where the Benjamin Franklin Bridge is now. And more recently, they've done excavation there. They're going to put an apartment house there now. But that was like in William Penn's time. But as that central waterfront became more for commercial ships, they moved the shipbuilding to outlying areas like Southwark and Kensington.
If memory serves, just to the north of Gloria Dei, wasn't the Simpson shipyard?
Yeah, the Simpson, right. Yeah,
We came across the Simpson family in some research we were doing.
right. We wrote an article in which they were involved, yeah, for Founders magazine, I think.
Yeah, I don't remember which issue that was, but it was one about ships. So for those who are unfamiliar with this term, what is a breakwater? Can you tell us why it was vital that this was constructed in the Delaware River in the 1820s?
Well, a breakwater is a long amount of fill that juts into a bay or ocean that has the function of breaking the wave action, like against a storm, for example. And they're often used like, jetties going out to protect the land, but they're also used to create harbors, like artificial harbors, to protect ships that might, or smaller vessels, that might be in the way of a coming storm, or just the breaker action. So this one that we talked about in the story about Schellinger and the Enoch Turley is the Delaware breakwater, which was the first breakwater or major breakwater built in the United States, and was a real monument of the time. It was started in 1828, and then in the 1840s they added on to it, 1860s some more, and then in 1901 they built another breakwater even further out, and the main engineer on it, I think the main one was William Strickland, who is a famous Philadelphia architect. He's known for working in the classical or the neoclassical style. The Second Bank of the United States, the Merchants Exchange on Dock Street, and so on, were designed by him. And he was able to devise, various apparatuses like derricks to, be able to build this construction. The first granite that they got, as I remember, came from the Palisades, up along the Hudson across from New York City, and it saved a lot of vessels, but it also caused problems. The first one did, problems worse than problems, because in this great blizzard of 1888 that we talked about, a great many boats were dashed against it, and many crew members lost their lives. And I think that's the reason why they built the one further out from it. So it's just, you can see it today, and it's just like off the coast of Lewis, Delaware.
You mentioned that the nature of the piers has changed dramatically over the last 200 years, but the configuration of the river has changed as well. Can you describe that for people who are unaware?
The configuration of the river. Well, the river has gotten narrower. It's in the real olden times, there used to be high bluffs along what is now the central portion of Philadelphia, and in Center City, Philadelphia, it's hard to see now because there's an expressway there, but it used to be quite steep and go down almost directly to a narrow beach where the river was. And that's where the original colonists that came with Penn, many of them tunneled into it and created cave houses there in the first days before the rest of the buildings were constructed. And Penn then ordered some steps to be built in various places to connect Front Street up at the top of the hill with what became Water Street below. I talked a moment ago about the Cherry Street steps, and now the last one is the Wood Street steps. So buildings on Water Street, often they were taller on the Water Street side than they were on the Front Street side, because you could unload a barrel directly from the pier into your building, and then through ramps or hoist or something, bring it up to Front Street, and then you were on the level of the city and put it in the back of a wagon and go off. Stephen Girard had his counting house, as did a lot of merchants there along Water Street. And when Stephen Girard died, he willed a great deal of money to extend this area that had already been filled in somewhat where the piers are and build like an avenue, which is Delaware Avenue. And then in the late 19th century, Delaware Avenue was extended even more, and the piers built out even more, which I'll get to in a second, how that was managed. And here, or that is where the church is, the church was, it still is to a certain degree, you can see, on a hill. And it also was right above the water line. And in fact, the bulkhead exists there, a brick bulkhead, to protect the church and the hill from erosion from the river. And the hill extended down to past where Washington Avenue is now. And there, Benjamin Franklin initiated a small fort, a battery there with cannon to protect Philadelphia from any encroaching enemy ships coming upstream. And on the other side, in Christian Street, there was a small creek used to go down Christian Street, and it wrapped around where Water Street is now into kind of an outlet there. So the street directly in front of, on the riverside of Old Swedes Church is Swanson Street. Now it's just a plaza. And that was what would you call it? What's the word? Well, anyway, can't think of the word. It's like it was a bridge over the creek.
Okay. Yeah.
And then extended in front of the church as well, with piers coming out from that. And later, when they demolished that hill, they used the fill to extend it out and out and out and build Delaware Avenue around there. So I did want to say something about, I had asked how was it that they were able to build the piers out? Well, there used to be islands in the river too. One major island was called Windmill Island. And that in William Penn's time, there wasn't an island there. It was just sort of like a sandbar. And I guess silt coming down river, some say maybe shipwrecks and so on, moored on it, and that helped to gather more sand and so on. And it became an island, and the island got longer and longer and longer. So by mid-century, it extended from up in, around Market Street, all the way down to really to Christian. And in the subsequent years, well, first they put a windmill on it, obviously. And there in the late 18th century, there was a gallows there because they could isolate the executions, because there, executions were often a public spectacle. So to get the business done, they put it out on an island. And I remember reading about, people still, from the banks of the river, they'd no, or yeah, cheer them on or something like that, because you could still see the hanging on the island. Later, though, it was, and then it became a land of amusement parks and dance pavilions and that sort of thing. And then in the late 19th century, as industry grew, it was seen more and more as an impediment. They wanted to extend the piers, they wanted to deepen the channel, and so they demolished it. Even before then, they had built a ferry channel that went right through the middle and separated it into two parts. And then they just demolished the whole thing, and they took all the fill from that, or a lot of it, and brought it down to League Island, and they used it to fill in the back channel there.
Yeah. it's hard to imagine this now since we have motorized vehicles, paved roads, and bridges, but ships were an important means of transportation to get people from one place to another. And the Delaware River in particular, like as we've been discussing, was a very, very active place for incoming and outgoing traffic. But we also had people, you know, coming from New Jersey or coming from Delaware over to Philadelphia and also to Gloria Dei Church.
Even to the church. That was in the very early days when the church congregation encompassed people from New Jersey and from up and down the river, and even the first minister of the church, Jacob, what was his name?
Fabricius.
Fabricius, yes. I'm sorry. Yeah, he lived up in what's now Fishtown near Penn's Treaty Park, and he would be canoed down. He was blind by that time, down river to go to the services. But yes, as you said, people would use the river and ships in general as basic transportation between cities because it was often much quicker than the bumpy roads they had then. So, for example, if you wanted to go to New York City from Philadelphia, well, one way was you would take a packet boat or something upriver to Bordentown or Trenton, and then you would take a coach to the Raritan Canal and take another boat along the canal to Elizabethtown, and then you take a boat, or sometimes the same one, you know, across New York Harbor to Manhattan, and the same going down to Baltimore. Or another route was to go, you know, go downriver to New York, let's say, and go all the way around Cape May and all the way up the Atlantic. It was not uncommon to go to New York City.
Well, I think you could still take the ferry from Cape May to Lewis, Delaware, even today.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, this still exists. It's just not as active because we have cars, you know, so and paved roads and everything. So you, in your discussion about Charles Schellinger, you described him as an operator of a pilot boat. Does this job still exist today?
Oh yes, sure. No, he wasn't the operator of a pilot boat. He was a pilot.
He was a pilot, yes.
The pilot boat, they called it a boat. It was a small schooner, so it was seaworthy. You know, it could go quite some distance. As we heard, this one went all the way down to Virginia and back. The Enoch Turley did, but so frequently in those times when a ocean-going vessel would come into the bay wanting to go upriver, then competing schooners of pilots would go out to meet it, you know, or they would cruise off the capes looking for vessels that might want to go in to try to drum up business for themselves. And then they would land, they would negotiate the terms, and the vessel would lower down a rope ladder, and the pilot would go on board, and there he would be on the bridge, let's say, with the helmsman, and he would then direct the ship, you know, knowing where all the shoals were and incoming, you know, other traffic and so forth. He had control of the ship. And that's what a pilot does today as well. And yeah, there's still a pilots association here. It's a union of pilots, but I believe they manage the tests that pilots have to take, and you have to nowadays have prior maritime experience, and then it's a 3 or 4 year program, and then you have to take a written exam. And I read, you have to sometimes plot your own charts on the exam. It's highly skilled trade, and I don't know. I don't think that they have the life-saving function that they did back in the 19th century, because now you have the Coast Guard and so forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, but they still exist.
Now, thank you, Michael, for giving the talk and answering these questions, and thank you all for joining us. I just want to remind you, if you don't already know, that the historic Gloria Dei Preservation Corporation is an all-volunteer board. We don't have any paid staff, so everything that we do, like programs like this, our podcast, producing a magazine, that's all volunteer-driven efforts. So if you are so inclined, please consider visiting our website and donating to our organization. Our website is preserveoldswedes.org. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great evening, and we hope to see you at a future program. Bye.